I would like to go back this morning to a series I started a while ago on the life of King David. David is probably one of the most well-known and revered kings of Israel, if you don't include Jesus in that list, of course. And we pick up the story of David before he has become king, and instead he is on the run from the current king, King Saul. And he has not been able to return home for many years. He has spent a lot of time living in caves and in deserts. And most likely through a mix of leadership gifting and God's provision, he has gathered around him a small army of about 600 men. And this is where we are in 1 Samuel, beginning in chapter 25. And I'd like to read that this morning. It is a bit of a longer passage of Scripture, but it's a story, and so it's a little easier for us to listen to stories. So turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 25, and we'll read the story of David, Nabal, and Abigail. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Maon. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. While David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favorable towards my young men, since we have come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, then waited. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to men coming from who knows where?' David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, 'Put on your swords.' So they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. One of the servants told Nabal's wife, Abigail, 'David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us. All the time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him.' Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servant, 'Go on ahead and I'll follow you.' But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, 'It's been useless all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him.' When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, 'My lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May my lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent. Now since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my master be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant. David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought to him and said, Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing until daybreak. Then in the morning when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. The story of 1 Samuel 25 is a story of poor reactions, of overreactions, and of a tendency towards sin. It is also the story of God's salvation, how God saved David from his sin. 1 Samuel 25 is a good illustration of the path to sin spoken of in James chapter 1, where it says, "Each one is tempted when by his own evil desires he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." I've chosen a picture of a whirlpool to illustrate this path to sin. And as many of you know, whirlpools are found in rivers and in oceans where the tide causes a quick movement of water. I spent a bit of time in my college years working on a fishing boat, a commercial fishing boat. And I can remember going through areas where these pools existed. In Seymour Inlet, there's a narrow passage where the ocean comes into Seymour Inlet. It's quite narrow, and at high tide, when the tide is ebbing and flooding, the water floods through that like a raging river. And on the other end of it, you'll see all these whirlpools in the area. And I can remember once going with our fishing boat past this river, as it were, on our way to some fishing traps that we were hauling. And I remember looking at these little whirlpools going on here and there and not thinking much of them until we came into contact with them. And the 40-foot boat that I was on would just begin to tilt way over, almost to 45 degrees. And I was sitting on the back of the deck, and I could see our captain at the wheel of the boat spinning frantically as he's trying to navigate the boat out of this whirlpool, and then it would sway back the other way. And it was really weird because it was flat, calm water, but our boat was operating like it was in some big ocean. The bigger the whirlpool, the bigger the effect. And you can imagine the effect that it looked like a small little hole in the ocean that was dragging our boat and swaying it back and forth. The bigger the whirlpool, the bigger the effect. And a big enough whirlpool can swallow up a boat and all who are on board. Sin can be like a whirlpool, drawing people into cycles of sin. And that cycle in the end leads to death. In this story, we see a couple of whirlpools. Or a few whirlpools. We see the whirlpool of David, of the sin that he could get trapped in. We see the whirlpool of Nabal and the sin that he gets drawn into. And then we want to think about our own whirlpools that we have, and some of us have many whirlpools that are revolving around us of sin that we can become trapped in. And I'd like to speak on those today. If I were to illustrate this cycle, I would say that sin begins with an opportunity. It begins with a desire or a reaction. With David, it is a reaction to Nabal's offense towards him and his men. His sin is fostered by a rationalization, an excuse David entertains for his plan of action. And in this story, sin is met with an intervention from God, an opportunity for David to change his course of action. It is a way out of the cycle of sin. And Nabal also has an intervention that David is giving him. David's men giving him an opportunity to not get caught in the cycle of sin. And so David is faced with a choice: to listen to God or to obey his own evil desire and carry out his sin. So sin begins with an offense. For David, it started in the desert of Maon. David and his men had settled down in the desert of Maon. Their presence alone would have brought a bit of peace to that area and a sense of security for those living there, and even for the servants, the shepherds of Nabal. Nabal's men described David's men as a wall of protection that was around them. In verse 7, it says the shepherds had been with David's men. They trusted David. Whatever relationship they may have had, David had hoped that this had earned him permission to speak to Nabal and to ask for some food for his men. But the conversation did not go so well. Instead, Nabal offends David's men, inferring that they are simply a bunch of renegades. The Bible describes Nabal as a surly and mean man, a bad-tempered person, very unfriendly. He probably did not have a lot of close friends. And we can assume from this story that the opportunity for sin with him was found in greed. We can see that he was greedy. We see the evidence of his greed in his response to David's men. It is not hard to imagine that he was consumed with his wealth. He did not want to give any of it to David or his men. Instead of being thankful and generous for the protection he had received from David and his men, he chose to ignore it. Instead of recognizing that his wealth had been preserved on account of David, he became possessive of that wealth. It's not that Nabal didn't have enough. You can notice in the story that it didn't take much effort, it seems anyway, for Abigail to gather quickly a bunch of supplies to take to David without even the knowledge of Nabal. And Nabal was oblivious to these things later on, as we see him celebrating as if he were a king. Nabal had more than enough wealth to share. He simply would not share it. And that was his sin. It was greed. For David, the opportunity to sin began with his pride. When David's men returned from their meeting with Nabal, David reacted, and we can see that he overreacted. He was angry that Nabal would have the nerve to refuse his request. And as he thought about it, you could imagine his anger, his temperature rose. When an offense sits in a person's mind and they think about it over and over again, it has a tendency to get bigger and bigger and bigger. David's pride got the best of him, and he resolved to respond to Nabal's offense with a very strong action. Greed and pride are just two types of sin that are drawn out of this story. There are lots of opportunities to sin, and there are a wide variety of sins. What is it that sets you off towards sin? Where are you vulnerable? Is it pride or unchecked anger like David? Is it greed like Nabal? Or is it jealousy, selfish desire or ambition, slander or gossip? Where are you prone to be drawn towards sin? We seem to be drawn so easily towards sin. We are overcome by our own desires and not what God desires. Is it because we forget about God's faithfulness towards us and think we need to work everything out ourselves? Is it because we trust ourselves more than we trust God? Is it because we are afraid God won't come through on his promises? We are by nature rebellious people. And Ephesians 2 talks about this. The Christian's previous life, the one that Jesus has broken us free from, all of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. I think many of you would agree. It doesn't take much of an opportunity for mankind to make a mess of it. So sin begins with an opportunity, and it grows when we rationalize it, when we rationalize our sin. Nabal justified his reaction for how he responded to David. He reasoned in his own mind that he didn't need to give anything to David. He argued that David and his men were disloyal soldiers, that they were against the kingdom of Israel, against the king Saul, that they were traitors. He reasoned in his own mind that he owed nothing to them. He might have even thought that he should turn David and his men over to Saul. But anyone who looks at this story and reads it through can realize that this is not why Nabal reacted this way. We can see that he is more concerned about his money than about David's supposed rebellion. And it is also easy for us to see the foolishness that is in his greed. Nabal's insults, outside of the quick thinking of Abigail, would have gotten him and the people around him killed. Nabal was not the only one who justified his actions. David also rationalized his reaction. He blamed Nabal. You can almost hear some of the conversation that might have been happening as they were en route to where Nabal was. How dare Nabal insult me like that? Does he not know who I am? I am the anointed one of God, the next one in line to be king. Does he not understand the power that I hold? Does he not see the soldiers that are behind me? I cannot let my men see that I am weak and do nothing about this. Nabal has brought this on himself. And David's reaction gains momentum as he rationalizes his sin. What maybe started as an offense becomes a resolve to settle the score. We are also often blind to sin. I used to think, when I was a kid, that I was a pretty good paper carrier. I used to deliver papers for the Vancouver Sun. Each day I'd get off a bus and go deliver papers. And I used to think, I'm a pretty good paper carrier. But if I look back in my mind to what I did, how I operated as a paper carrier, I am amazed that I kept my job, frankly. Because all in my mind as a kid was get papers from A to B. That was all my mind thought through. Didn't think through much else other than that. And as I went to deliver papers, I used to have to bike a few kilometers to where the houses were. And en route to that, there was a highway. And over that highway was a little overpass. You might have been in Vancouver and seen the green railing overpasses that you see once in a while here and there. I used to have to bike over one of those green railing type bridges to get to the other side. And on one side there's this little kind of spinning around thing that you go down on your bike, and I wasn't always that successful of riding down that, and every once in a while my bike would hit the side and papers would fly everywhere. And on a good windy day it was just chaos. It was just paper flying everywhere. So I'd run after these papers, shove them all together, kind of try to flatten them out. And you could imagine some of the owners of the houses that I delivered papers to, and they opened the door and they saw this kind of pile of paper on their front, and it kind of had the front page sort of there, but it was all kind of jammed in together. And on rainy days, I really didn't take all that care at making sure they were dry. I wasn't thinking that the person getting the paper actually wanted to read the paper. I was just trying to get it to the doorstep. And you can imagine someone who opened the door and seeing a sopping wet newspaper and thinking to themselves, how am I supposed to read this? We are often blind to our mistakes, to our sin, and we think it's no big deal. Or we make excuses for them. Maybe a coworker is working hard and he's getting noticed by the boss. And so maybe we say a few things about them that isn't too favorable. Maybe we say a few negative things about them because we don't really like it that they're gaining the attention of the boss. Or maybe we want to get the most of what we are selling, so we don't really tell the full truth about what it's worth or if there's something wrong with it. We hold grudges. We speak poorly of people. We manipulate. We sin. And the sin damages those around us. I have seen families split apart because the people committing sin have no sense of their wrong. They have justified in their own mind what is acceptable and what reason they may have for their actions. And at times our tendency towards sin, it seems hopeless. If a king chosen by God can't avoid sin, how are we supposed to avoid it? But this story gives hope because God intervenes. As David is heading towards Nabal, and he is blind to a sin. He is en route. He's going to do what he's going to do. He is blind to the consequences that his actions, if completed, will carry with them. But God reveals to David his sin. He reveals it to him before he has a chance to act on it. God sends Abigail, and in her wisdom, she sees the danger that David is heading towards. God reveals sin to David through Abigail. She points out the wrong that David was heading towards. She points out the guilt that he would be under if he was to continue in this conflict. She gives David a reason to stop what he is doing. And not only does she do that, God uses Abigail to remind David of his faithfulness. David is reminded that God, in his power, provides for God. God is his provider, and God has plans to prosper him. It was God who would make him great. It would not be by his own hand. He had not needed to worry about Nabal. He did not need to be angry with Nabal. And that is the good news. God intervenes. David's eyes are opened to the truth. When we see our sin, we should rejoice in the fact that God has revealed it to us. He has removed our blindness. He has shown us our wrong to keep us from even greater wrongs. I understand it is difficult to be made aware of our sin. We don't really like to fail. We are frustrated when we lack self-control. We are frustrated when we forget about God and his faithfulness. And we are disappointed when we make a mess of things. And it's not easy having people bring some of those things to light in our lives. But the fact that we are aware of this sin is a sign that God is intervening in our life. How has God revealed truth to you? How has he spoken into your life? How has he intervened? Who are the people he has used to speak the truth into your life? We need to be aware of God's intervening. And we need to be willing to listen when God intervenes. Not like Nabal, who disregarded what the men of David said. We need to be able to discern God's voice from all other voices vying for our attention. And this means we need to be regularly in the Word of God so that we can recognize his voice. Without God's intervention, we are blind to sin. There are many people who are blind to sin. They don't see the problem. They don't see their sins as a problem. They feel the pain of sin, but they do not know what it is. God shows us the problem. God intervenes in our lives. He reminds us of his providence. He shows us our sin. He reveals to us the saving work of Jesus on the cross. And he shows us that Jesus' work on the cross gives us a hope for our future. But not only our future hope, also a present hope that God continues to intervene in our lives and continues to save us from our sin. God uses people as a part of this process. Abigail listened to the prodding of God. She was gracious, yet she was bold. She fell to her knees in humility at David's feet, yet she was bold enough to reason with David, to speak about the sin that he was about to commit. What would have happened if Abigail refused to go to David? Abigail was a willing participant. She didn't sit back and say, well, it's not my problem. She realized that even though she did not cause the problem, the consequences would impact her and the people she loved. God desires to use us to intervene in our world. He has put us here to live in this sinful world so that he can use us to influence it. Look at Jesus' prayer in John 17. He says, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one." God doesn't call us out of the world so that we don't need to worry about being affected by it. He has us in the world so we can react, and react in a godly way. It is tempting to live in fear of this world, and that fear can paralyze us. And I'm sure Abigail was afraid of what David might do as he and his men approached. Could you imagine? As 400 angry men coming down a hill with swords? Like, if that doesn't cause fear in you, I don't know what would. I am sure that Abigail was afraid, but she did not let that fear paralyze her. It is easy to become fearful, but we can have confidence in God. God is at work. He is at work now, in this present day. He is at work at this moment in time. He is at work in us, and he is at work around us. And that should give us all the confidence to live in this world, but not of this world. God intervenes through us if we, like Abigail, are willing participants. If we are aware of what is happening around us and are willing to take action. If we are listening to the spurring of the Holy Spirit at work in our lives. Who has God called you to be a voice to? And are you willing to be a voice like Abigail, with humility, with respect, yet still with boldness, the same boldness as Abigail? The choice is ours. David recognized God's message through Abigail. He listened to God's message and he gave credit to God for intervening. David allowed God to be the giver of justice, and he rested in the fact that God would make all things right. When God intervenes in our lives, do we listen? Or do we choose to ignore? What if David had ignored Abigail and continued on to kill Nabal and his household? What would have happened to David's reputation? What would have been the fallout of those lives that had been taken by David and his men? Who really would have been willing to follow David as king with all kinds of guilt that hung over his head because of this? What happens when we take justice into our own hands? It creates opportunity for more sin and hurt, which creates opportunity for more sin. And as you can see, the cycle spins, and it spins downward. The Bible is full of examples like this. If we look at the story of Joab, David's military commander in 2 Samuel, we will see that in a battle, Abner killed Joab's brother. So later on in the chapters, we see that Joab, in revenge, kills Abner. And when Solomon becomes king, he has Joab put to death because of his treachery. And you can see the cycle goes downward and downward. And if you look at the stories all in between this larger story, you will see lots of opportunities where people engage in sin, and it spirals others into sin, and it spirals downward. Just think for a moment of your own sins. What cycles can they start? What cycles have they started? I am thankful that with God's intervention that we can play a part in ending the cycles of sin rather than continuing to engage in the cycles of sin. God in the end deals with Nabal. He puts an end to Nabal's life. And we are inclined to rejoice with David that Nabal has died. It is like the resolve at the end of a story. Good wins out in the end, and evil is dealt with. But we need to be careful with how we view Nabal, how we view his death. It should be a reminder of the justice that is in line for anyone who continues in opposition to God. We are no less deserving than Nabal to see the justice of God. Instead, we can rejoice that God is patient with us, that through the cross of Christ, he has made a way possible for us to be forgiven of our sin. We can rejoice that God intervenes, that God shows us our sin, and that God provides a way out for us. The story of David, Nabal, and Abigail shows us that sin begins with an opportunity. We are drawn towards sin, and our sin is sent down the road when we rationalize it, when we make excuses for them, when we blame others for them. And we see without God's intervention, we can be thrown into a cycle of sin and cause others to be thrown into a cycle of sin. But with God's intervention, we are able to break out of cycles of sin and be impacted by the salvation of God. In my college years, I spent a little bit of time up in Houston, BC. I was working with my youth pastor up there, and I lived for a period of time with a family called whose names were the Bardens. And they are a very kind and generous couple. And while I was living with them, I didn't have a whole lot of money, and I didn't have a car, and so they were generous enough to lend me their vehicle or their vehicles as I needed, which probably was not the best idea for them because in my younger years I was a bit of a vehicle wrecker. And at one point, they lent me their one-ton truck, and I proceeded to back out of their garage with the door open, which was not a good idea. You know, you're looking out the door, and you're like, then the whole door gets spun backwards, and I didn't have any money, and I was at the kind of time of my life where you kind of close your eyes and you hope it all goes away. You know that time in your life, but it wasn't the only vehicle I wrecked of theirs. I took their van out one day. I was going to work and I hit a moose. And again, I was a young man with no money and a hope that it would all go away. Close my eyes. But they were very generous to me, and I got away with not having to pay a whole lot. But God has his way of reminding us of things. And God has a way of reminding us of the grace that we need to exercise in our own lives. When I got back from Houston and started going back to college again, I was commuting from my parents' home. And one day I was getting in my car. It was in the evening. And I started the car, and a little light came on the dash in my car. It said there was a light out in my car, and so I thought that was kind of weird. So I got out of my car and I went to the back of my car, and one of my lights wasn't working. And so I went to inspect it, and upon closer inspection, it didn't look right. And it was dark out. I couldn't really see, but my light didn't look like it normally did. It still was there, but it kind of had a bit of a bubble to it. And I was wondering, why is there just a bulge? Is maybe something heated it and it's bulged out or something? So I was looking closer, and upon inspection, I saw it was like there was a whole bunch of pieces together that were there bulging. And an even closer look, I noticed there was glue in there. And then my mind went to my younger brother. He had shot a hockey ball from the road and missed the carport and hit my car, and proceeded to use a glue gun to glue all the little pieces of my taillight back together. And I remember thinking, why did you do that? That frustration there. And not long after that, when I was in Port McNeill, my brother was up there as well, and both my brothers were up there. And I was in a board meeting, and I heard this crunch in the church parking lot. And I came out the door, and there was a truck backed into my other taillight, the only one I had remaining. And who was standing beside the taillight? My brother, looking at me with those eyes like, I'm sorry. But I remember distinctly It was like a voice of God saying, "He who has not sinned, cast the first stone." I had wrecked vehicles and I'd hoped it would all go away. And I needed to be gracious to my brother who was also hoping it would all go away. You know, that kind of, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." Who are the people in our lives who we are holding on to some sin that they've committed against us? And you know, they maybe are a bit too sheepish to come to us and ask for forgiveness, but yet we're holding on to that grudge or that anger towards them. But for everyone who's wronged us, there are people who we have wronged in our lives. God, by His grace, has shown us our sin and has forgiven us our sin. And by God's grace, we are called to forgive others and to break these cycles of sin. David broke the cycle of sin. He was able to escape that whirlpool. Nabal did not listen to the voice, and he chose to continue in that cycle, and God dealt with him. My prayer is that we would see the cycle of sin and that we would be moved by God's intervention so that we can escape and not be harmed to others in their sin.